In July of 1938, the most famous industrialist in America accepted a medal designed personally by Adolf Hitler. 3 years later, his company would be celebrated as the arsenal of democracy. Both statements are true. That's the problem. This is unseen hand. The dark history of money, the stories your civics class skipped. Here's what nobody tells you about the Second World War. While American boys were dying on the beaches of Normandy, while the United States government was officially, legally, at war with Nazi Germany, American corporations were still operating factories inside the Reich, producing the trucks that carried German soldiers to the Eastern Front, refining the fuel additives that let Luftwaffe bombers reach London, cataloging the names of Jews on punch cards manufactured in New York. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's in the U.S. Senate's own records. It's in declassified files at the National Archives. It's in vesting orders signed by the Alien Property Custodian. The men who built America's war machine had spent the previous 15 years building Hitler's. In 1924, Germany was finished. The Treaty of Versailles had levied reparations of 132 billion gold marks. The Reichsmark had collapsed to 4 trillion to the dollar. Middle-class savings were wiped out in a single summer. The Weimar Republic was 3 bad winters from civil war. Enter Charles Dawes, American banker, future vice president, the man who would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925. His proposal was elegant. America would lend Germany dollars. Germany would pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain would repay their war debts to America. A perfect closed loop. The Dawes Plan. Followed by the Young Plan in 1929. Together, roughly $3.5 billion in American capital pumped into the German economy between 1924 and 1930. In today's money, somewhere north of $65 billion. But here's the part the Nobel Committee left out of the citation. That money didn't just stabilize the Reichsmark. It rebuilt every factory that mattered. Krupp, Siemens, Thyssen Steel, IG Farben. The same plants that 15 years later would manufacture the Panzer III, the Messerschmitt 109, and the gas used at Auschwitz. When the Great Depression hit in October 1929, American capital fled. The German economy collapsed for the second time in a decade. And into that vacuum stepped a former corporal from Linz with a microphone and a uniform. Hitler did not cause the Weimar collapse. The American loan cycle did. When the money flowed, Germany rebuilt. When the money stopped, Germany burned. The Nazis didn't rise from nowhere. They rose from the ashes of a fire that Wall Street had lit, and Wall Street had walked away from. By the time Hitler took power in January 1933, American corporations were not just present in Germany. They were structural. 5 companies, in particular, became load-bearing pillars of the Nazi war economy. Ford-Werke AG, wholly owned subsidiary of Ford Motor Company, Dearborn, Michigan. Plant location, Cologne, on the west bank of the Rhine. Output by 1942. Military trucks, half-tracks, and 3-ton transport vehicles for the Wehrmacht. Labor force, a documented mix of German workers, French POWs, Soviet civilians, and Buchenwald inmates marched in daily. On July 30th, 1938, 2 German consular officials, Karl Kapp and Fritz Heller, arrived at Ford's headquarters in Dearborn carrying a velvet box. Inside, the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. The highest decoration the Third Reich ever awarded to a foreigner. Ford was the first American to receive it. He kept the medal. He never returned it. By 1935, Opel, owned outright by General Motors of Detroit, was the largest automaker in Germany. It produced the Opel Blitz, the standard 3-ton transport truck of the Wehrmacht. Every Panzer division, every Eastern Front supply chain ran on Blitz axles. GM also held the patent for tetraethyl lead. Without it, modern aviation fuel doesn't exist. Without aviation fuel, the Luftwaffe doesn't fly. GM's chairman, Alfred P. Sloan, kept Opel under American ownership until December 1941, the month after Pearl Harbor. When asked, decades later, why GM had not divested earlier, Sloan's answer was the closest thing this story has to a thesis statement. It was simply business. In 1929, Standard Oil of New Jersey, the company that would become Exxon, entered into a patent-sharing agreement with the German chemical giant IG Farben. The technology shared tetraethyl lead, synthetic rubber, and high-octane aviation fuel. IG Farben is the same IG Farben that, by 1944, would be operating a captive synthetic rubber plant inside the perimeter of Auschwitz. The same IG Farben whose subsidiary, Dagesh, manufactured Zyklon B. The U.S. Senate's Kilgore Committee, investigating in 1945, did not call this commerce. They called it economic appeasement. The Justice Department prosecuted. Standard Oil paid a fine and went back to work. IBM's German subsidiary was called De Homag. Throughout the 1930s and into the war, De Homag leased Hollerith tabulating machines to the Reich. These were the world's first commercial data processors, punch card computers, the great-grandparents of every server farm running today. What did they process? The 1933 census of Germany, the 1939 census of occupied Poland, the roster of every Jewish citizen of Berlin, Vienna, Amsterdam, Prague, railway timetables for the deportations, inmate numbers at Buchenwald. The machines did not kill anyone. They made the killing efficient. They turned a continent of human beings into a sortable database. And every one of them carried, on the side, the same 4 letters, IBM. In 1937, Hitler personally awarded IBM's chairman, Thomas J. Watson, the Order of the German Eagle, Merit Cross with Star. Watson returned it in 1940. The machines stayed. 39 Broadway, Manhattan. The offices of the Union Banking Corporation. Founded 1924. Director and shareholder, Prescott Sheldon Bush, future U.S. Senator from Connecticut. Father of one American president, grandfather of another. UBC's function was specific. It was an American clearinghouse for the financial empire of Fritz Thyssen, the German steel baron who, in 1929, had personally donated 100,000 Reichsmarks to the Nazi Party. One of Hitler's earliest, largest, and most decisive private patrons. On October 20, 1942, 10 months after Pearl Harbor, with American Marines bleeding on Guadalcanal, the U.S. government seized Union Banking Corporation under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Vesting Order No. 248, signed by Alien Property Custodian Leo T. Crowley. A subsequent investigation confirmed the Thyssen's control. Prescott Bush was never charged. The assets were quietly returned after the war. UBC was dissolved in the 1950s. Bush won his Senate seat in 1952. 5 companies, 5 different mechanisms, 1 outcome. American capital, American patents, American management. Flowing into the engine of a regime, the United States was officially preparing to fight. Ford-Werke in Cologne produced Wehrmacht trucks with forced labor, owned through 1945. General Motors Opel in Rüsselsheim built the Blitz trucks and Luftwaffe engines, owned until December 1941. Standard Oil shared patents with IG Farben for aviation fuel and synthetic rubber, active throughout the war. IBM's De Homag in Berlin provided punch card machines for the census and the camps, active until 1941. And Union Banking Corporation at 39 Broadway in New York served as the Thyssen Empire's clearinghouse, finally seized in October 1942. The pattern is identical. It's a bank that technically didn't belong to anyone. The Bank for International Settlements, Basel. Founded 1930. Original purpose: to administer German reparations payments. Board composition: representatives from the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, and the Banque de France, all sitting at the same polished oak table. When war broke out in September 1939, every other institution of international finance went dark. Cables stopped, wires froze, embassies closed. The BIS did not. Throughout the war, through the fall of France, through the Battle of Britain, through Stalingrad, through D-Day, American, British, and German central bankers continued to meet in Basel. They settled accounts. They cleared transactions. They moved gold. Some of the gold the BIS handled was looted from the Central Bank of Czechoslovakia, from the Bank of Belgium, from the Netherlands, and, according to post-war Allied investigations, some of it had been melted down from objects of more intimate provenance: wedding rings, dental fillings, the personal effects of the people IG Farben's gas had killed. The American directors of the BIS did not resign. They did not protest. They sat at the table in Basel, in Switzerland, while the country that had placed them there fought a war against the country that had placed the man across from them. Here is the part that breaks the official story in half. When the war ended, the men who had run Hitler's industrial machine, his intelligence apparatus, and his rocket program were not put on trial. They were not hanged at Nuremberg. They were hired. Operation Paperclip, 1945 to 1959. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians transferred to the United States. Their Nazi Party records, when records existed, were quietly altered, sanitized, or sealed. The architect of the V-2 rocket, Werner von Braun, a man whose weapons were assembled by slave labor at the Mittelwerk underground factory, became director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. He put Apollo 11 on the moon. He died with a NASA pension and a state funeral. The Gehlen Organization, 1946. The U.S. Army hired in its entirety Reinhard Gehlen's Foreign Armies East, the Wehrmacht intelligence division that had spied on the Soviet Union throughout the war. Gehlen was a Nazi major general. His files on the USSR were the most complete in existence. The CIA paid him to keep working. His organization became the BND, the Intelligence Service of West Germany. It still exists. Operation Sunrise, March 1945. While American GIs were still dying in the Hurtgen forest, an OSS officer named Alan Dulles met secretly in Bern, Switzerland, with SS General Karl Wolff. The subject: the surrender of German forces in Italy. The Soviets, America's allies, were not informed. Stalin accused Roosevelt of negotiating a separate peace. Some historians mark that meeting as the first true day of the Cold War. Alan Dulles would become the longest-serving director of the CIA. His brother, John Foster Dulles, would become Secretary of State. Their old law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, had spent the 1930s representing American corporations with Nazi clients. The men who fought the Nazis, the men who funded the Nazis, the men who hired the Nazis, they were the same men. Now look at the world you live in. 1. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The United States declared sanctions. By the end of that summer, more than 1,000 Western companies had pledged to leave the Russian market. By 2024, the Yale-Seeley list, the most cited tracker of corporate Russia exits, was still naming dozens of major Western firms continuing operations or scaling back only superficially. Same playbook, different war. 2. Apple manufactures roughly 90% of its iPhones in China. Tesla operates a gigafactory in Shanghai. The U.S. Commerce Department, simultaneously, runs an export control regime designed to prevent advanced semiconductor technology from reaching Beijing. The same government that restricts the chips. The same government that taxes the iPhones. 3. The international banking system. SWIFT, the Bank for International Settlements, yes, it still exists, in the same building in Basel, continues to clear transactions for central banks of countries the United States is actively sanctioning. The mechanism has not changed. only the names on the nameplates. 4. When Saudi Arabia ordered the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside its Istanbul consulate in 2018, Western defense contractors did not pause arms shipments. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE Systems. The contracts continued. The official explanation, strategic necessity. 5. Every major Western bank fined for laundering money for cartels, sanctions violators, or hostile states in the past 15 years. HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, BNP Paribas, has paid the fine and kept the license. None of the executives went to prison. The cost of doing business is now a line item. 6. And in the world of artificial intelligence, where this video is almost certainly being recommended to you by an algorithm, American companies train their largest models on Chinese-fabricated chips, while Chinese companies train theirs on American architecture exfiltrated through third-country supply chains. The two systems claim to be at war for the future. They are also each other's best customers, which means the official explanation of the 1930s, that it was an accident of bad timing, of incompetence, of unique historical circumstance, cannot be true, because the pattern keeps repeating. Different decades, different flags, different villains, same mechanism. Capital does not have a flag. It has a balance sheet. And when capital and country point in different directions, capital wins, and the country writes a press release. So the question isn't whether American corporations helped build the war machine that killed American soldiers. That's settled. The vesting orders are public. The Senate hearings are transcribed. The medals are in museums. The question is whether what happened between 1924 and 1945 was an aberration, a tragic, never-to-be-repeated failure of oversight in a country still finding its footing as a global power, or whether it was the blueprint. Because if it was the blueprint, then the greatest generation didn't defeat fascism. They inherited the assets. The British Empire didn't lose World War II. It bankrupted itself fighting Germany while America financed both sides, bought the empire's bonds, and replaced it. The dollar replaced the pound. American bases replaced British garrisons. The companies that had supplied the Wehrmacht turned around and supplied shape. And if that's the blueprint, then everything happening today, the Russia exits that aren't really exits, the China entanglements that no one will untangle, the sanctions that have loopholes you could fly a 747 through, isn't a betrayal of the system. It is the system. The question then isn't whether history is repeating itself. The question is whether it ever stopped. If you've made it this far, you already know how this channel works. We don't tell you what to think. We show you the receipts. Subscribe. Because history isn't what happened. History is what they're still doing. This was Unseen Hand.